Greetings, one and all, once again, back to Exploring Arda, a Tolkien-centered podcast where I'm your host, Jackson, and I go through a bunch of Tolkien's works other than Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I kind of stuttered over that part, but that's kind of part of the show. So, obviously you guys are back for, part 2, chapter 2 of the Children of Húrin, right over here. Yes, Children of Húrin, very, very good. But before we kind of get into everything, be sure to check out my other stuff on my channel, which includes Grim Captivation, my paranormal podcast, which I'm having a lot of fun with. A lot of projects, a lot of episodes further on that show. Having a lot of fun. And then I also have a couple of my nature hikes called Traversing Through Terra. And that's kind of like simply what it is. It's just kind of like my nature hikes. And I kind of just do that for fun whenever I have the time. Which slowly will become less and less. But yeah, check those stuff out. And as always, be sure to check out my own fantasy book called The Lands of Ordia, Power of Heaven. It is available on Amazon. And yes, still writing the second one, second book, because it is a series out of 5, but I've been writing a lot of lore and history to it as well. But now that we are kind of like out of that, out of the intros and whatnot, yes, we're going back into Children of Húrin here. And this chapter is the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Obviously, through reading through the Silmarillion, this was a really big battle where Morgoth kind of like gets the upper hand in a way. A lot of people realize that not only is he, the big bad Ainur from very, long ago, but his forces are terrible to go against. So, but yeah, so we are here, and this is basically with King Fingon and obviously with Húrin going into battle and whatnot. But I think we'll just kind of go right into the story here. So here we go. Many songs are yet sung, and many tales are yet told by the elves of the Nernieth Arnuediad, the battle of unnumbered tears, in which Fingon fell and the flower of the Eldar withered. If all were now retold, a man's life would not suffice for the hearing. Here then shall be recounted only those deeds which bear upon the fate of the house of Hador and the children of Húrin the steadfast. Having gathered at length all the strength that he could, Maedhros appointed a day, the morning of midsummer. On that day the trumpets of the Eldar greeted the rising of the sun, and in the east was raised the standard of the sons of Feanor, and in the west the standard of Fingon, king of the Noldor. Then Fingon looked out from the walls of Aethel Sirion, and his host was arrayed in the valleys and woods upon the east of arid Wethrin, well hid from the eyes of the enemy, but he knew that it was very great. For there all the Noldor of Hithlum were assembled, and to them were gathered many elves of the Phallus and of Nargothrond, and he had great strength of men. Upon the right were stationed the host of Dorlamine, and all the valor of Húrin and Huar his brother, and to them had come Haldir of Brethil, their kinsmen with many men of the woods. Then Fingon looked east in his elven sight far off, a dust and the glint of steel like stars in a mist, and he knew that Maedhros had set forth, and he rejoiced. Then he looked towards Thangorodrim, and there was a dark cloud about him, and a black smoke went up, and he knew that the wrath of Morgoth was kindled, and that their challenge would be accepted, and a shadow of doubt fell upon his heart. But at that moment a cry went up, passing up the wind from the south from vale to vale, and elves and men lifted up their voices in wonder and joy. For unsummoned and unlooked for, Turgon had opened the leaguer of Gondolin, and there was come with an army, 10,000 strong, with bright mail and long swords and spears like a forest. Then when Fingon heard afar the great trumpet of Turgon, the shadow passed and his heart was uplifted, and he shouted aloud, and here's some elven words here, Utulien aure, Aya eldalie ar atanatarni Utilian aure. The day has come. Behold, people of the Eldar and fathers of men, the day has come. And all those who heard his great voice echo in the hills, crying, Auta I Lome, the night is passing. It was not long before the great battle was joined, for Morgoth knew much of what was done and designed for his foes, and had laid his plans against the hour of their assault. Already a great force out of Angband was drawing near to Hithlum, while another and greater went to meet Maedhros to prevent the union of the powers of the kings. And those that came against Fingon were clad all in dun raiment, and showed no naked steel, and thus were already far over the sands of Enfogolith before their approach became known. Then the hearts of the Noldor grew hot, and their captains wished to assail their foes on the plain, but Fingon spoke against this. Beware of the guile of Morgoth, lords, he said. Ever his strength is more than it seems, and his purpose other than he reveals. Do not reveal your own strength, but let the enemy spend his first in assault on the hills. For it was the design of the kings that Maegos should march openly over the Anfagolith with all his strength, of elves and of men and of dwarves. And when he had drawn forth, as he hoped, the main armies of Morgoth in answer, then Fingon would come out from the west, and so the might of Morgoth should be shaken as between hammer and anvil, and be broken to pieces. And the signal for this was to be the firing of a great beacon in Dorthonion. But the captain of Morgoth in the west had been commanded to draw out Fingon from his hills by whatever means he could. He marched on, therefore, until the front of his battle was drawn up before the stream of Sirion, from the walls of the Barad Aethel to the fen of Seric, and the outposts of Fingon could see the eyes of their enemies. But there was no answer to his challenge, and the taunts of his orcs faltered as they looked upon the silent walls and the hidden threat of the hills. Yeah, and I'm actually going to do a quick summary because this is kind of like in the midst of the battle. Well, almost. Basically, a bunch of like the forces of elvenkind and mankind, pretty much, and I guess a little bit of the dwarves, with Nargothrond and whatnot. They pretty much team up in a way, and some of them want to pretty much just charge Morgoth head on, and Turgon's like, no, you can't really do that. You can't just like send the full force with you, because then he'll realize, like the full strength that you guys really have. You guys don't want to do that. You guys gotta wait for like the opportune moment. But obviously with Morgoth, he's also scheming as well, where he has a huge amount of his own forces, and so he's trying to distract one side with the other so that he can try to separate them and pick them off kind of like one by one. So, and from what I gathered, that's kind of like what it's all about. So, strategic planning in battles. I'm not really a strong suit in that, but yeah, on we go. Then the captain of Morgoth sent out riders with tokens of parley, and they rode up before the very walls of the outworks of the Barad Aethel. With them they brought Gelmir, son of Gwilyn, a lord of Nargothrond, whom they had captured in the Bragolach, and had blinded, and their heralds showing him forth, crying, "We have many more such at home, but you must make haste if you would find them, for we shall deal with them all when we return, even so." And they hewed off Gelmir's arms and legs, and left him. By ill chance at that point in the outpost stood Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, with many folk of Nargothrond, and indeed he had marched to war with such strength as he could gather because of his grief for the taking of his brother. Now his wrath was like a flame, and he leapt forth, upon horseback, and many riders with him. And they pursued the heralds of Angband and slew them, and all the folk of Nargothrond followed after, and they drove on deep into the ranks of Angband. And seeing this, the host of the Noldor was set on fire, and Fingon put on his white helm, and sounded his trumpets, and all his host leapt forth from the hills in sudden onslaught. The light of the drawing of the swords of the Noldor was like a fire in a field of reeds, and so fell and swift was their onset that almost the designs of Morgoth went astray. Before the decoying army that he had sent west could be strengthened, it was swept away and destroyed, and the banners of Fingon passed over the Anfagolith, and were raised even before the walls of Angband. Ever in the forefront of the battle went Gwyndor and the folk of Nargothrond, and even now they could not be restrained. And they burst through the outer gates and slew the guards within the very courts of Angband, and Morgoth trembled upon his deep throne, hearing them beat upon its doors. But Gwyndor was trapped there and taken alive, and his folk slain, for Fingon could not come to his aid. By many secret doors in Thangorodrim, Morgoth let forth his main strength that he had held in waiting, and Fingon was beaten back with great loss from the walls of Angband. Then in the plain of Anfagolith, on the 4th day of the war, there began the Nernieth Arnuediad, all the sorrow of which no tale can contain. Of all that befell in the eastward battle, of the routing of Glaurung the dragon by the dwarves of Belagost, of the treachery of the Easterlings and the overthrow of the host of Maegos, and the flight of the sons of Feanor, no more is here said. In the west the hosts of Fingon retreated over the sands, and there fell Haldir, son of Halmir, and most of the men of Brethil. But on the 5th day as night fell, and they were still far from the arid Wethrin, the armies of Angband surrounded the army of Fingon, and they fought until day, pressed ever closer. In the morning came hope, for the horns of Turgon were heard, as he marched up with the main host of Gondolin. For Turgon had been stationed southward guarding the passes of Sirion, and he had restrained most of his folk from the rash onslaught. Now he hastened to the aid of his brother, and the Noldor of Gondolin were strong, and their ranks shone like a river of steel in the sun. for the sword and harness of the least of the warriors of Turgon was worth more than the ransom of any king among men. Now the phalanx of the guard of the king broke through the ranks of the orcs, and Turgon hewed his way to the side of his brother. And it is said that the meeting of Turgon with Húrin, who stood beside Fingon, was glad in the midst of the battle. For a while, when the hosts of Angband were driven back, and Fingon again began his retreat. But having routed Maedhros in the east, Morgoth had now great forces to spare, and before Fingon and Turgon could come to the shelter of the hills, they were assailed by a tide of foes thrice greater than all the force that was left to them. Gothmog, high captain of Angband, was come, and he drove a dark wedge between the elven hosts, surrounding King Fingon and thrusting Turgon and Húrin aside towards the fen of Sarek. Then he turned upon Fingon, and that was a grim meeting. At last Fingon stood alone with his guard dead about him, and he fought with Gothmog until a Balrog came behind him and cast a thong of steel around him. Then Gothmog hewed him with his black axe, and a white flame sprang up from the helm of Fingon as he was cloven. Thus fell the king of the Noldor, and they beat him into the dust with their maces, and his banner, blue and silver, they trod into the mire of his blood. So we're going to do a little bit of a break there. Fitting that I actually kind of wore a Balrog shirt today. I forgot that the Balrog came and pretty much like cast like this circle of fire so that only Gothmog and Fingon pretty much, duke it out between each other. Kind of forgot about that, and it's just kind of fitting. So yeah, obviously the whole thing of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears is that at first, they get all the way up to Angband and even up to, Thangorodrim and Morgoth, there you go, they both have the word goth in it, so Morgoth is actually like, at first kind of like, not so much scared, but just like surprised more of like, but before his defeat actually does happen, obviously the rest of his folk, his little minions, he pretty much sends a whole swarm of them and they take over, and then now Morgoth has the upper hand on the battle. And while he does this, Glaurung comes into play, and Balrogs come into play, and Gothmog slays Fingon, and there's a lot of bad things that just happen once Morgoth decides to play his hand, which is basically a bunch of these monstrous beasts that pretty much take the field and dominate over the rest of the elves and men. So, but the whole thing of King Fingon against Gothmog and fighting in this like a ring of fire, pretty much is what I kind of pictured it. And then the whole thing with Gothmog with a black axe and then a white flame springing from the helm of Fingon is just like this really cool epic imagery. You get like this big bad orc commander, and he's having this duel with the king of the Noldor. Very, very cool stuff. I really like picturing that in my mind. It's very cool. So, and I'm sure there's like paintings of, or just anything, fan art, things like that, of this battle, this famous battle. So, but on we go into the story. The field was lost, but still Húrin and Húar and the remnant of the House of Hador stood firm with Turgon of Gondolin, and the hosts of Morgoth could not yet win the passes of Sirion. Then Húrin spoke to Turgon, saying, "Go now, Lord, while time is, for you are the last of the house of Fingolfin, and in you lives the last hope of the Eldar. While Gondolin stands, Morgoth shall still know fear in his heart. Not long now can Gondolin remain hidden, and being discovered it must fall," said Turgon. "Yet if it stands only a little while," said Húr, "then out of your house shall come the hope of elves and men. This I say to you, Lord, with the eyes of death, that we part here forever, and I shall not look on your white walls again. From you and from me a new star shall arise. Farewell." Maeglin, Turgon's sister's son, who stood by, heard these words and did not forget them. Then Turgon took the counsel of Húrin and Húar, and he gave orders that his host should begin retreat into the passes of Sirion. And his captains Ecthelion and Glorfindel guarded the ranks to right and left, so that none of the enemy should pass them by. For the only road in that region was narrow and ran near the west bank of the growing stream of Sirion. But the men of Dorlemin held the rear guard, as Húrin and Húar desired, for they did not wish in their hearts to escape from the Northlands, and if they could not win back to their homes, there they would stand to the end. So it was that Turgon fought his way southward, until coming behind the guard of Húrin and Húar, he passed down Sirion and escaped, and he vanished into the mountains and was hidden from the eyes of Morgoth. But the brothers drew the remnant of the mighty men of the house of Hador about them, and foot by foot they withdrew, until they came behind the fen of Sarek, and had the stream of Rivell before them. There they stood, and gave way no more. Then all the host of Angband swarmed against them, and they bridged the stream with their dead, and encircled the remnant of Hithlum as a gathering tide about a rock. There, as the sun westered and the shadows of the arid Wethrin grew dark, Húr fell, pierced with a venomed arrow in the eye, and all the valiant men of Hador were slain about him in a heap, and the orcs hewed their heads and piled them as a mound of gold in the sunset. Last of all, Húrin stood alone. Then he cast aside his shield and seized the axe of an orc captain and wielded it two-handed. And it is sung that the axe smoked in the black blood of the troll guard of Gothmog until it withered. And each time that he slew, Húrin cried aloud, "Aure Intaluva, day shall come again." 70 times he uttered that cry, but they took him at last alive by the command of Morgoth, who thought thus to do him more evil than by death. Therefore the orcs grappled Húrin with their hands, which clung to him still, though he hewed off their arms, and ever their numbers were renewed, until he fell buried beneath them. Then Gothmog bound him and dragged him to Angband with mockery. Thus ended the Nerniath Arnuediad, as the sun went down beyond the sea. Night fell in Hithlum, and there was a great storm of wind out of the west. Great was the triumph of Morgoth, though all the purposes of his malice were not yet accomplished. One thought troubled him deeply and marred his victory with unquiet. Turgon had escaped his net, of all his foes the one whom he had desired to take or destroy. For Turgon of the great house of Fingolfin was now by right king of all the Noldor, and Morgoth feared and hated the house of Fingolfin because they had scorned him in Valinor and had the friendship of Ulmo, his foe, and because of the wounds that Fingolfin gave him in battle. And most of all, Morgoth feared Turgon, for of old in Valinor his eye had lighted on him, and whenever he drew near a dark shadow had fallen on his spirit, foreboding that in some time that yet lay hidden in doom, from Turgon ruin should come to him. Yeah. So that is that is the end of the chapter 2, and I actually might go into chapter 3 because it's a shorter chapter. It's like a few pages. So yeah, obviously another terrible thing happens again, where Húr is slain with the venomed arrow in the eye, which is that's that. Talk about imagery. That's like, oh wow. Like, even if it's like a brief sentence, that sounds terrible. And obviously the last of Húrin's soldiers and the rest of his men obviously fall, as the orcs are pretty much just like flooding over him, and the whole thing of him like pretty much like double hand, an axe, and like shouting out, "Day shall come again." Oh, it's so cool. Like another another really cool imagery of this, pretty much this figure just chopping off the orcs, left and right, saying, "Day shall come again." And he says this like 70 times, and he's just trying to hold on to like the last bit of hope that he can. But obviously, as the orcs swarm over him, obviously it's too much for even one guy, despite, his lineage and all that stuff. So, and it's like terrible, like what they do. Like they literally, the host of Angband swarmed against them, and they bridged the stream with their dead. That's a lot of death. Like, you talk about the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Now it makes sense, because not only is there a lot of orc casualties, but like just like the Edain and the elves, they are slaughtered like mercilessly and piled on top of each other. It's like, it's terrible. That sort of imagery is terrible to kind of think of too. So, but yeah, obviously Húrin is taken captive for pretty much Morgoth's own plans and whatnot. And he's like, well, I'm going to do something even worse than death for him. So, with that being said, I will go into chapter 3, which is called The Words of Húrin and Morgoth. So this is actually, what happens, right after Húrin is captured. So on we go with the story. Now by the command of Morgoth, the orcs with great labor gathered all the bodies of their enemies and all their harness and weapons, and piled them in a mound in the midst of the plain of Anfaglith, and it was like a great hill that could be seen from afar. And the Eldar named it Hod-in-Nerniath. But grass came there and grew again, long and green, upon that hill alone in all the desert. And no servant of Morgoth thereafter trod upon the earth beneath which the swords of the Eldar and the Edain crumbled into rust. The realm of Fingon was no more, and the sons of Feanor wandered as leaves before the wind. To Hithlum none of the men of Hador's house returned, nor any tidings of the battle and the fate of their lords. But Morgoth sent thither men who were under his dominion, swarthy Easterlings, and he shut them in that land and forbade them to leave it. This was all that he gave them of the rich rewards that he had promised them for their treachery to Maedhros, to plunder and harass the old and the children and womenfolk of Hador's people. The remnant of the Eldar of Hithlum, all those who did not escape into the wilds and the mountains, he took to the mines of Angband, and they became his thralls. But the orcs went freely through all the north and pressed ever southward into Beleriand. There Doriath yet remained in Nargothrond, but Morgoth gave little heed to them, either because he knew little of them, or because their hour was not yet come in the designs of his malice. But his thought ever returned to Turgon. Therefore Húrin was brought before Morgoth, for Morgoth knew by his arts and his spies that Húrin had the friendship of the king, and he sought to daunt him with his eyes. But Húrin could not yet be daunted, and he defied Morgoth. Therefore Morgoth had him chained and set in slow torment. But after a while he came to him and offered him his choice to go free whether he would, or to receive power and rank as the greatest of Morgoth's captains, if he would but reveal where Turgon had his stronghold, and aught else that he knew of the king's counsels. But Húrin the Steadfast mocked him, saying, Blind you are, Morgoth Boglir, and blind shall ever be, seeing only the dark. You know not what rules the hearts of men, and if you knew, you could not give it. But a fool is he who accepts what Morgoth offers. You will take first the price, and then withhold the promise. I should get only death, if I told you what you ask. Then Morgoth laughed, and he said, Death you may yet crave of me as a boon. Then he took Húrin to the Hod in Nerniath, and it was then new built, and the reek of death was upon it. And Morgoth set Húrin upon its top, and bade him look west towards Hithlum, and think of his wife and his son and other kin. For they dwell now in my realm, said Morgoth, and they are at my mercy. You have none, answered Húrin, but you will not come at Turgon through them, for they do not know his secrets. Then wrath mastered Morgoth, and he said, Yet I may come at you, in all your accursed house, and you shall be broken on my will, though you are all made of steel. And he took up a long sword that lay there, and broke it before the eyes of Húrin, and a splinter wounded his face, but Húrin did not blench. Then Morgoth, stretching out his long arms towards Dorlamine, cursed Húrin and Morwen and of their offspring, saying, Behold, the shadow of my thought shall lie upon them wherever they go, and my hate shall pursue them to the ends of the world. But Húrin said, You speak in vain, for you cannot see them, nor govern them from afar, not while you keep this shape and desire still to be a king, visible on earth. Then Morgoth turned upon Húrin, and he said, Fool, little among men, and they are the least of all that speak. Have you seen the valor, or measured the power of Manwë and Varda? Do you know the reach of their thought? Or do you think, perhaps, that their thought is upon you, and that they may shield you from afar? I know not, said Húrin. Yet so it might be, if they willed, for the elder king shall not be dethroned while Arda endures. You say it, said Morgoth. I am the elder king, Melkor, first and mightiest of all the Valar, who was before the world and made it. The shadow of my purpose lies upon Arda, and all that is in it bends slowly and surely to my will. But upon all those whom you love, my thought shall weigh as a cloud of doom, and it shall bring them down into darkness and despair. Wherever they go, evil shall arise. Whenever they speak, their words shall bring ill counsel. Whatsoever they shall do, turn against them. They shall die without hope, cursing both life and death. But Húrin answered, Do you forget to whom you speak? Such things you spoke long ago to our fathers, but we escaped from your shadow. And now we have knowledge of you, for we have looked on the faces that have seen the light, and heard the voices that have spoken with Manwë. Before Arda you were, but others also, and you did not make it. Neither are you the most mighty, for you have spent your strength upon yourself, and wasted it in your own emptiness. No more are you now than an escaped thrall of the Valar, and their chain still awaits you. You have learned the lessons of your masters by rote, said Morgoth, but such childish lore will not help you. Now they are all fled away. And before I actually go into the next page here, there's another illustration, and this is pretty much Húrin, pretty much just stuck on his, tortured spot. I know you can't really see it very well because there's a glare, but it is there. So a really fascinating picture, again, by Alan Lee. He does the best thing. So On we go again, sorry. Kind of in the midst of dialogue here, so. This last then I will say to you, thrall Morgoth, said Húrin, and it comes not from the lore of the Eldar, but it is put into my heart in this hour. You are not the lord of men, and shall not be, though all Arda and men will fall in your dominion. Beyond the circles of the world you shall not pursue those who refuse you. Beyond the circles of the world I will not pursue them, said Morgoth, for beyond the circles of the world there is nothing. But within them they shall not escape me until they enter into nothing. You lie, said Húrin. You shall see and you shall confess that I do not lie, said Morgoth. And taking Húrin back to Angband, he set in him a chair of stone upon a high place of Thangorodrim, from which he could see afar the land of Hithlum in the west and the lands of Beleriand in the south. There he was bound by the power of Morgoth, and Morgoth standing beside him cursed him again, and set his power upon him, so that he could not move from that place, nor die, until Morgoth should release him. Sit now there, said Morgoth, and look out upon the lands where evil and despair shall come upon those whom you have delivered to me. For you have dared to mock me, and have questioned the power of Melkor, master of the fates of Arda. Therefore with my eyes you shall see, and with my ears you shall hear, and nothing shall be hidden from you. And that is pretty much the end of chapter 3. I kind of wanted to kind of read through it a little bit more. Pretty much because it is like the curse of the curse of Húrin's bloodline in a way. Obviously, with the whole thing of Túrin having all this, quote unquote, bad luck, and all these bad things happen to him. A lot of the, I guess rumors, I suppose, is that because Morgoth did actually like curse Húrin's family, pretty much, if they weren't cursed already, because I mean, like their daughter dies with like the evil breath, and then now, Húrin has to pretty much saw his own brother literally just get killed in battle, and King Fingon is slayed. So all these like terrible things already happened, and now Morgoth is the one. He finally puts the curse on Húrin's family. So, and this is just kind of like the introduction of like why Túrin has all this bad things happen to him in a way. So, but yeah, pretty much at the end of that chapter is pretty much Morgoth and Húrin kind of going back and forth, saying Melkor saying like, "Hey, I'm the ruler of the world. You got to respect me, and you will bend to my will eventually." And then there's Húrin, who's just like, "No, actually won't, because we believe in greater and better things, pretty much." And they're pretty much going back and forth, obviously. And Húrin will not pretty much bend to Morgoth's will. So, kind of just shows how I guess steadfast he is, and just how loyal he is too. So, and it also is a great example of how Túrin kind of acts in his own way, fighting for the light and whatnot. So it's kind of great to kind of go back and reread that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, so that is the end of this episode. Hopefully you guys enjoy it, the story. Hopefully I will finish it before the end of the year, which is kind of my goal, knock 2 books out in 1 year for you guys, and for me personally too, just to say that I read another book. But yeah, so from earlier, obviously, check out my other segments on my show, Grim Captivation, my paranormal podcast that is growing very much so in the last few days. I don't know what it would be right now, because I'm kind of recording stuff in advance, but thank you guys so much for all the support. And obviously traversing through Terra, all of my nature hikes. I think there's only like 3 or 4 of them that are just kind of like floating out there just because it's fun. And then obviously my fantasy book, The Lands of Ordia, Power of Heaven, having fun with that stuff, and just obviously always writing more and more history. So hopefully when the rest of my stuff comes out, it'll just be this huge expansive world of mine. So I think with all that being said, just stay tuned for another episode, and may the light of Albereth be with you all. Farewell.